All right, so here we have our sentence from this afternoon in class. This is the second half of our sentence, question 7 of Moreland and Fleischer's Unit 5 exercises. Lacrimis feminas inimicorum movere optavi, ut viros orent, ne pium bonorum factorum damnent, sed non patui. So as I always say, the first thing we need to do is identify the verbs. And of course, we can do this in a number of ways. We can we can go from left to right and just attempt to identify the parts of speech by process of elimination. Or it's probably better if we attempt to look for the personal endings of verbs, because that will allow us to kind of zero in on those words that are most important as we begin the translation process. So here, of course, we have the personal ending of verbs. We have our active personal endings here on the upper left. We have our passive personal endings on the right, and we have those personal endings that are kind of exclusive to the perfect tense of the indicative. So let's return to our sentence and see what we can do. We notice as we are reading through that we see at least 4 verbs in this sentence. So since we have such a complex sentence, the more verbs we have, the more complexity, typically anyways. It's best that we underline them just so we don't forget. So our first verb we have is optavi, and our second verb is orent, follows closely after. And I've decided just to use green here. I'm going to save some of my more exotic colors for later. Okay, our third verb we have is damnant, and our last verb is patui. Now, of course, we look to identify these verbs because they're going to tell us a lot about the sort of structure of our sentence, what clauses we have, which clauses are main and which clauses are subordinate. So it's most important in our next task to identify just what clause these main verbs are in. And in order to do that, we are looking for certain elements in a sentence that are going to subordinate ideas. One of the ones that happens to jump out, let's go down to magenta here. One of the elements that jumps out is the ut. Ut in Latin is a word that oftentimes subordinates verbs, especially when they're in the subjunctive. Ut, when followed by a verb in the subjunctive, introduces purpose clauses, result clauses, and indirect commands. And if we begin with ut and we go over to our next verb, we're going to see orent, which happens to be in the subjunctive. So I think our instincts are right. It's probably best if we sort of just put that in between parentheses. We're not going to deal with it now. That's kind of the point of parentheses. It allows us to kind of filter out information that is important, but maybe shouldn't be prioritized right at this moment. Also, as we keep reading, we see a ne, and ne, when followed by a verb in the subjunctive, really does exactly what the ut does, only it negates it. So where ut is the positive, ne typically will negate. And we look at damnant, and that also happens to be in the subjunctive. Now, we'll return to these verbs and properly identify them when we have to deal with them. But right now, we're trying to simplify our task here and really kind of put on the back burner a lot of information that we don't have to worry about right now. That leaves only 2 verbs in our sentence, optavi and patui, and they're conjoined, I guess you can say, by said, but that simply gives us two verbs in our main idea. So let's start with optavi and everything to the left of that verb. So, of course, we start with verbs because they're going to tell us not only what we should be expecting in terms of subjects of the sentence, who the person of the verb is and who may be governing the verb, but also it will tell us whether we should expect a direct object, which in Latin we know is the case of the accusative, or even whether we should expect an indirect object. So let's identify an optavi here. And of course, you can go to your glossary and hopefully this is a word that is mated into your working vocabulary. We see opto, optare, optavi, optatus. And that has 4 principal parts. That is definitely a verb. And if we look at the infinitive form here, optare, the second principal part, that should tell us that this is a first conjugation verb. Optavi, we see, is formed from the third principal part, a part where we get something called the perfect stem. We remove the I from the third principal part, and that gives us a stem onto which 3 tenses are built, tenses of the perfect system. Those are the perfect tense, the pluperfect tense, and the future perfect tense. So that's very helpful. We know that we've kind of reduced or maybe sort of pinpointed this verb a little further. This verb is either going to be perfect, pluperfect, or future perfect. And we can determine or distinguish which of those it is based on what tense endings it has. So if we look at our tense ending chart, we go to our perfect system of verbs, the verbs that are built on the perfect stem, and we notice that to have a perfect tense verb, we don't have a tense ending. It's simply enough to be built on the perfect stem. That's distinctive enough. The pluperfect tense ending is ERA, and the future perfect tense ending is ERI. So returning to our verb optavi, we notice that there are no tense endings. There is just, in fact, the personal ending. Here we have the personal ending for the first person singular, as we see here. So we know that optavi, and it's good to write this down because after you do all this work, what oftentimes happens is you kind of forget all of the work that you've done. We've identified it as being first person singular, perfect, it's the active voice, and it's in the indicative mood. We know it's the active voice almost or simply because there was nothing there to suggest that this was passive. The passive voice will have different personal endings for the passive, or in fact a lot of the tenses in the passive are formed by compounds. And there was nothing to indicate that this was subjunctive, but that's something that we will obviously get to later. So having identified this as a first-person singular, there's really no point to go back into the sentence to look for a subject. When we have the first person or the second person of verbs, we more often than not that indicates that it's I or we as the subject, or you or you plural. So we don't need to look further in the sentence for our subject. I think we can really just begin to translate here. First person singular is I, and optavi, that's a verb that means to hope or desire. And since it's the perfect tense, we could say I desired. Now, the reason why we look for the verb and look for the subject is it will tell us a lot of information that may be coming up in the sentence. So we don't have to be overwhelmed by too much information. We could almost be led by the work that we've done to sort of focus in on information that information we could expect to come in our sentence. So the verb optavi is transitive, which means it should have a direct object. I could desire a car. I could desire some ice cream. But another thing about this verb in Latin is frequently its verbal action can oftentimes be completed by an infinitive called a complementary infinitive, an infinitive that completes the verbal idea. And if we look here in the sentence, right to the left of optavi, we see movere. So let's identify movere. I suspect it's an infinitive, but it's always good to kind of confirm, your instincts here. So let's put movere up here. and we go to our glossary, we sort of look back into our working vocabulary, we see moveo, movere, movi, motus. So there are our four principal parts. It's a second conjugation verb, something that we can tell by going to the infinitive. There's the ere there. I don't typically bother with macrons or accents because you really won't see them outside of Latin textbooks. But we know this is second conjugation. We know that this is movere and not movere, because if we look at the first principal part, we see the E there beside the O. If this were third conjugation verb, it would just be the O. So this is moveo, movere. At any rate, we've done work here, but we know it's the infinitive, it's the second principal part, so we can just add that to our verbal idea here. I desired, and moveo, movere means to move. So, this verbal idea expects a direct object. I desired to move what? Well, let's look in our sentence and see if we have that information. Now, when looking for a direct object, in Latin, we're looking for a noun in the accusative. So let's start with lacrimis here. Lacrimis, we look it up. Sometimes can be spelled instead of with the I there. It sometimes has a Y, but in our vocab, we see lacrima, lacrimae, two principal parts. So that definitely is a noun. The second principal part here, the diphthong AE, indicates that it's a first declension noun, and with the exception of maybe 5 nouns, all nouns in the first declension are feminine. So we are looking for a first declension noun that ends IS. So we go to our paradigm of nouns. So here are our noun paradigms. We go to the first declension and we're looking for IS, and we see IS in the dative plural and the ablative plural. So I think that's worthwhile. We should write that down. We've done the work. We don't want to forget it. So IS is dative or ablative plural. But that's all I want to do. I don't really care all that much what this word means, especially because we're looking for a direct object. We're looking for the accusative. So let's just kind of file that information away for now and continue on our search for a direct object. Let's go to our next word here. And we have feminas. And let's choose a different color. Let's choose brown. My palette, I'm amazed, is already limited here. So feminas. And we look up feminas, and we see femina, feminae. Again, two principal parts, so that's a noun. The AE, the diphthong, and the second principal part, the genitive singular. That tells us it's a first declension noun. This also is feminine, and we're looking for AS ending in the first declension of nouns. So let's go to our noun paradigm again, our first declension, and the AS we find in the accusative plural, and that's exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for an accusative. We're looking for the direct object. So we can go ahead and translate that after the verb. I desired to move and femina means woman, so in the accusative plural it means woman. I desired to move the women. And after translating the subject, verb, and object, there really isn't much left grammatically in a sentence. A lot of the information remaining is kind of incidental. It may be prepositional phrases, kind of sort of giving us a little more context, or we may have genitives remaining in the sentence. One thing we're typically not going to expect is the dative. The dative, the case of the indirect object, we typically will know to expect that if the verb is a verb of giving or providing. But optavi, meaning to hope, probably it's likely that we're not going to have a dative left. So let's go back to lacrimis, and let's assume that it's not dative. Let's take it as the ablative plural. We've already done this work. Let's see what we can do here. I desired to move the women something, and lacrima means tears. So the ablative case is a case of kind of relations, of prepositional usages. I desire to move the women. It's likely something called an ablative of instrument, so or means, by means of tears or with tears. Now, there happens to be about 18 different forms of the ablative, and I'm not going to go through all of them now, but the ablative of means or instrument is never preceded by a preposition, unlike a lot of other forms of the ablative. So I think we could be confident in translating, I desired to move the women with tears. Now, there's only one other noun left, and that's inimicorum. So let's see what we can do with that. And if we look up inimicorum and we see inimicus, inimici, now that has two principal parts as well, so we know it's a noun. It ends in I in the second principal part, the genitive singular, so that tells us it's a second declension noun. And when we have a second declension noun, it could either be masculine or neuter. The US form tells us it's masculine. There are two other endings we could expect in the nominative singular here, an R or an ER, if it were to be masculine. And if it were neuter, it would solely be UM. So let's look at our second declension masculine paradigm and look for ORUM ending. So we go to our paradigm of nouns. We go to the second declension masculine. Here are our three options for the masculine and the nominative, but as I said, we're looking for ORUM, and here we have it in the genitive plural, the case of possession. So the genitives, these are fairly easy to deal with. Genitives, as I've said many times, is the most promiscuous case. It kind of gets with any noun in closest proximity. So inimicorum is closest to the noun feminas. So all we do is, beside women, write the preposition of, and inimicus means enemy, so in the genitive plural it would be enemies. So I desire to move the women of the enemies with tears. So there is our first main idea taken care of. We have a choice now. We can either go straight to the sed non patui and finish off the main idea, or we can translate the subordinate clauses. And since I don't want to spoil things, I don't want you to, I don't want to ruin this sentence, because even though this person is desiring to move the women of the tears, we have a big but. So let's not spoil it. Let's do some of the, subordinate clauses. Now, my brackets seem to have moved slightly, but I still think we can work it out. We have ut viros orent. Let's see if I can move that. Yeah, slightly. Let's see, I'll move this one over. That's a little clearer. Maybe not. And yeah, that's why. Okay, well, good enough. Let's do ut viros orent. And orent, we look it up in our glossary, or we refer back to our memory. We have oro, orare, oravi, oratus. This is a first conjugation verb as well. It has four principal parts. Orent seems to be built off the present stem. Okay, it has no AV there. The present stem you derive from the second principal part and remove the RE. But here we have an E, and that suggests a vowel shift has happened. When we have the stem vowel, ora, changed to an E, that's indicative of a present subjunctive verb. So I think we can go ahead and identify this verb. NT, going to our personal ending. Where are our personal endings? Here they are. NT is an active ending in the third person plural, so let's go and write that down. Okay, so we have a third person plural, and I said the vowel shift to an E is present subjunctive, and it's also active. So we have now all the information we need. Since it's third person, we know that the subject has changed. The subject of Octavi was first person. Now we have a third person. And typically we should look in the clause to see if we have a new nominative plural. There is only one there's only one other word left, viros, and if we were to look it up, let's change colors here a little bit. How about light red? Looks pretty strong to me. But anyways, if we look up viros, again, this is a word you typically get in the first chapter of any Latin textbook, or maybe the second chapter. Vir, viri. It is a second declension noun. The I tells us that it's is second declension, and the R ending indicates that it's masculine. So we're looking for the OS ending on the second declension noun in the masculine. We go to our second declension masculine paradigm, and OS is right here in the accusative. So that's something to write down, just so we don't forget. Viros is accusative plural. But most importantly, all that work told us is that viros is not going to be the subject. We're looking for the nominative plural, and we don't see any nominative in this sentence. So we could simply assume NT third person plural, they. Okay, they is the subject. We're just going to assume the pronoun that is contained in the personal ending. So let's write that. And so I desired to move the women of the enemy with tears, and ut with the verb in the present subjunctive, given the context we have here, should really indicate a simple purpose clause. So we say, in order that they likely meaning the women in the previous idea, in order that they might, and oro orare in medieval Latin frequently means to pray, or even just simply to speak. In classical Latin, oftentimes the meaning is to beg or request. So let's say beg. In order that they might beg. And there we go. In order that they might beg, and now this verb is transitive, so we expect a direct object, and we've already identified viros in the accusative case, in order that they might beg the men. So, we've done the first, we have done the first subordinate clause. Let's go to the second subordinate clause, the nay clause. Now, I mentioned before that nay sometimes, or just tends to do the same work as ut does, followed by a verb in the subjunctive, except that it does it in the negative. However, when nay or ut is introduced by a verb of petitioning or commanding, sometimes it introduces a subordinate clause called an indirect command. So let's first confirm that damnant here is in the subjunctive, and let's move that. There we go. That just keeps things neat. All right. Okay, damnant. Let's go to a glossary. We look up this verb, or we look up this word, and we see damno, damnare, damnavi, damnatu. So yes, in fact, 4 principal parts. That is a verb. It is a first conjugation verb. Damnant is built off the present stem. Notice damnant doesn't have a V there. That would indicate that it would be built off the perfect stem. It's built off the present stem, except once again we have a shift from an A stem vowel to an E, and that is indicative once again of the present subjunctive. And that's actually what we want, because these subordinate ideas, these result clauses, these purpose clauses, these indirect commands require a verb in the subjunctive. So we look at the NT ending. We go to our personal ending chart. NT is an active personal ending in the third person plural. So we write third person plural, and we know it's present subjunctive, and it's an active personal ending. Third person plural, active, present subjunctive. Now, the question is there a new nominative plural? Is there a new subject of this? Well, we have to look in the sentence. Let's go to pium. Let's see if we have a new nominative. So we look up pium in our glossary, and we see, and let's see, let's get this working, and we see pius, pia, pium. Well, three principal parts, that tells us that's an adjective. Now, pius is a first and second declension adjective. That means that it's using endings from the first and second declension to modify nouns. So what we're going to do is consult our first and second declension adjective paradigm, looking to see where the appears. We do this because it's important to know what it's modifying. So let's go to our adjective paradigm in the first and second declension adjectives and look for We see it in three places. We see in the neuter nominative singular, we see in the neuter accusative singular, and we see in the accusative masculine singular. So we could already start canceling out information because we know that this isn't going to be neuter nominative singular because damnant needed a neuter plural. So that the verb really has doesn't admit pium as a neuter singular subject. It needs nominative plural. Of the other two, we don't really need to worry about that just yet, whether it's neuter or accusative, because right now we're looking for a subject of damnant. So we'll come back to pium. If we don't want to have to redo some of our work, we could write down some of the possibilities. We know it's accusative, and it's either it's either masculine or it's neuter. We look at bonorum. Well, let's just change the color. You know what? I think we could look at all those. Look at all those turquoises. Let's go to turquoise 5. Let's be a little bit brave here. Turquoise number 5. I feel like once again I need like a fan brush number 7. This seems more like the joy of painting than Latin. Bonorum we look up and we see find bonus, bona, bonum. Again, that's a first and second declension adjective. So let's find where ORUM appears in the adjective paradigm. And we look at our first and second declension adjective paradigm, and we see genitive ORUM for the masculine and genitive ORUM for the neuter. So we can write that down too. So we know it's genitive, plural, masculine, or neuter. And of course we're writing all this because we want to know what these adjectives are modifying, and adjectives modify nouns in case, number, and gender. We don't just put an adjective, we don't have it modify a noun because they look the same. They have to agree in those three different qualities. So, and let's use green number 3, just while we're being a little brave in our color choices here. And let's look up factum. Okay, now factum, we look it up and we find that this in fact is a noun from factum facti. That is it has two principal parts, so we know it's a noun. I suggests that it is a second declension noun, and the here in the nominative singular tells us that it's neuter. So we want to know where ORUM is in the neuter second declension paradigm. So let's go look at our noun paradigms. Let's go second declension neuter, and we are looking for factorum, and we see that it is genitive plural. So we can go ahead and identify that. So here we have neuter genitive plural. So here we have a noun in the neuter genitive plural and an adjective that could be neuter genitive plural. So it's likely bonorum and factorum are in complete agreement. So let's put those two together. Let's find another color. There was a nice, let's see, oh, salmon. Oh, I have to go find salmon. There's salmon. Okay, so let's have bonorum agree with factorum here. So we put it together just so we don't forget. There. And let's put all that back. All right, so we did all that work attempting to find a nominative plural, but we see that there is no new nominative plural in that idea, so we have to assume they. I mentioned before this is an indirect command in the negative, so we say, I desired to move the women of the enemy with tears in order that they might beg the men not to do something. Not to, and damnant in the present subjunctive, we can just say condemn. Begged the men not to condemn. Now we want to, this verb is transitive, we want a direct object, and we've already identified pium as an accusative idea. Now pium is an adjective without a noun to modify, and that's something that we call a substantive. And what we do with substantives is we simply look at the gender and assume a generic noun for it to modify. If pium is masculine, we assume the pious or honest man. If it's feminine, we assume pious or honest woman. And if it's neuter, we assume pious or honest thing. Now here, we know it's masculine or neuter, and I think it's likely that it's a masculine. So we say, in order that they might beg the men not to condemn the or a, maybe they're talking in generalities, a pious man, and then we're just left with a genitive idea. And genitives, as I said, are typically preceded by the preposition of and attached to the closest noun or noun idea, and that would be the substantive pium. So we could say of good, and factorum means deeds. Now, I think that would be sufficient if we just left it right there, but damnant, when we translate it with the genitive, doesn't really mean to condemn somebody of deeds. We have to tweak it slightly. It means to condemn somebody for something. So we can say for his good deeds. So up till this point we have, I desired to move the women of the enemies with tears in order that they might beg the men not to condemn a pious man for his good deeds. So that seems pretty good so far, but we still have the second main idea to translate, sed non patui. Luckily it's pretty short, so we should be through fairly quickly. So we go to patui, our verb in this second of the main ideas. Let's keep with salmon. I don't think it's been given enough play today here. And we look up patui, and we see possum, posse, patui, and it doesn't have a fourth principal part, but it is in fact a verb. So it's a verb. It happens to be an irregular verb formed from the verb to be, sum and esse, but attached to the prefix of potentiality, pos or pot. So patui, it doesn't mean to be, it means to be able. And notice patui is exactly the form we have for the third principal part. So we could identify it immediately. The third principal part happens to be the first person singular perfect active indicative. And we can write that in now. First person singular perfect active indicative. But even if you didn't know that of the first principal part, if you knew how to identify stems of vowels, and if you knew how to look for tense endings, and if you knew how to identify the personal endings on verbs, you would eventually arrive at that information as well. So if it's first person singular, we could simply put in our subject. We don't need to look in the clause for a nominative idea. It's going to be the pronoun I. But said I, and this is perfect, was not able. And of course they want me to capitalize the N here in our little computer program. So let's look at the whole sentence here as it's marked up. Lacrimis feminas inimicorum movere optavi, ut viros orent, ne pium bonorum factorum damnant, sed non patui. And we have our completed translation. I desired to move the women of the enemies with tears, in order that they might beg the men not to condemn a pious man for his good deeds, but I was not able to do so. So that is the completed translation for the second half of sentence 7 in the exercises for Unit 5 of Moreland Fleischer. Until the next sentence.